Good day. Before I proceed with this Friday night update of the situation in Ukraine, the crisis there, I'm just going to cover some housekeeping matters. The first is to thank Dr. Steve Turley for his extremely warm words about our channel and about myself personally. It's always gratifying to hear people say things like that, and I am very grateful to him, as we at the Duran are. And I would also say that obviously we follow him closely and we think exceptionally highly of his work too. That's the first thing to say. The second is that after some discussion, Alex, Christoforou and I have decided to resume our broadcasts on YouTube. We have now done 2 additional live streams, which you can also find on YouTube, as well as on our various other platforms like Library, Rumble, Odyssey, and the rest. And lastly and finally, just to repeat that if you're watching any one of our channels, any one of our videos on Rumble, if you look to the top of the video, you will see a red maroon button. If you press that, that will take you directly to our locals page, where you can join our locals homepage, where you can join us on locals, become a member, participate in our work, publish your own content, and join me in my live streams, which I do every Wednesday. So those 3 things I did wish to make. Now let's turn to the most recent events. Now, the event which has made world headlines today is the fire at the Zaporozhye nuclear plant. Now, I'm going to begin with that part of the information about the reports about this fire, which I consider to be authoritative and which are really not open, is not open to challenge. Briefly, some sort of fire did take place overnight. However, this was apparently at an administrative building. We have this information from the Ukrainian operator of the plant, and the fire at this administrative building was put out very quickly by emergency services. There were no radiation leaks. There was no damage to the plant itself. The plant continues to operate normally and safely. Now, that account from the Ukrainian operator of the Zaporozhye nuclear plant has apparently been confirmed by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which also confirms that there has been no radiation leak, and I consider that report to be completely definitive. Where there is, of course, a huge amount of debate and argument is about what exactly caused the fire. And here you have a Ukrainian account that this was caused by a Russian attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear plant, which involved shelling, which was conceivably dangerous and which somehow set part of the plant on fire, or not perhaps the plant itself, but this building presumably. And then you have the contrasting Russian account, which is that a unit of the Ukrainian military tried to break into the plant, got caught up in a firefight with parts of the Russian military, which had already secured the plant, and that before this unit this Ukrainian unit withdrew, it set the administrative building on fire. Now, I think it is impossible from this distance, my distance in London, to verify the truth of either account. I'm going to say straight away, however, that on this instance, I do find the Russian account more plausible. The Russians are extremely familiar with nuclear power plants, and of course the Zaporozhye nuclear plant was built by the Soviet Union, and Rosatom, the Russian nuclear power agency in control of nuclear power stations within Russia, will no doubt have all the plans and will be very familiar with its layout. I cannot conceive of any situation where the Russian military would launch an attack on a nuclear plant, which is actually located fairly close to their own country, and put themselves, their country, and Ukraine at risk, and cause an incident which would, to be straightforward about it, look very bad for them. So I think on balance, the Russian account that there was some kind of a firefight is more plausible, though whether one would go as far as to talk about a sabotage group infiltrating the plant in order to carry out some kind of sabotage there, well, that is a part of the Russian story which I'm going to be more skeptical of. I'm far from convinced that is true, but the story of the firefight seems to me to be much more plausible than the story of the shelling. That, I want to stress, is my opinion. I obviously have no independent information or corroboration. I'm not present at the Zaporozhye plant. I've not talked to anybody who is there, but it does seem to me that this is the most plausible explanation of what took place. Now, that's all I'm going to say about this incident. It's already been used in the media and information wars. I'm not going to say more. What I am going to say is a few brief things about the overall military situation. And it does seem now as if the encirclement of the Ukrainian army in the Donbass is now in effect. In other words, those troops do seem to be trapped in what the Russians like to call the cauldron. There are apparently 12 brigades of the Ukrainian army who are trapped there. And that, it seems to me, is the decisive event, if it is indeed true. And sooner or later, those troops will either have to lay down their arms and be taken prisoner, or dispersed to their homes, or melt away in some fashion. But anyway, it looks as if organized resistance from the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine is coming to an end. And the Russians, by the way, refer to these encirclements, which are very much a feature of Russian military strategy and have been ever since, well, the Napoleonic Wars. They refer to these things as cauldrons. The idea is that you encircle the troops, the enemy troops, in a kind of trap. I should stress that one mustn't think of this, as I said, as a medieval siege. It's the surrounding troops can be fairly widely dispersed, but they're able to control what goes on in the cauldron because of the location of their artillery, their observations, their drones, which are flying over the cauldron and keeping track on what the encircled troops are doing. They can prevent supplies going in. They can prevent complete formations coming out. The intention is gradually to raise the temperature, if you like, of the so-called cauldron. That's, by the way, apparently why it is a cauldron, to raise the temperature for the encircled troops until their position becomes unsustainable and even unbearable. And there's already some reports, which again I can't corroborate, that these troops who have been encircled are running low on fuel and ammunition, without which, of course, an army cannot function. There is no possibility of relief. There is no military force that Ukraine has that can break through and break this encirclement. So it does seem to me as if over the next few days, and it may take perhaps a week, but sooner or later, this force in eastern Ukraine is going to either disintegrate or surrender, in which case the active part of the war will in effect be over. And I would add also that in this part of the front, it's become fairly clear to me that on the Russian side, most of the actual heavy fighting has been done not so much by the Russian army itself, but by the militia of the two republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Anyway, that is the big cauldron. There is a smaller cauldron, one which is more like a siege. This is of the various troops of the Ukrainian military in Mariupol, where apparently a lot of the right-wing battalions are based, who have also been surrounded. And here, I'm afraid, in what is apparently a civilian area, the city, a bitter battle seems to be more plausible. So with these two encirclements, the major part of the Ukrainian army, the part of the Ukrainian army that constitutes its major strike force, is now desperately vulnerable and facing probable defeat. Obviously, when those two cauldrons are secured, when the Ukrainian army in the big cauldron and the Ukrainian force in Mariupol are destroyed, that will release far more troops from the Russian and militia to advance further into central Ukraine and perhaps invest Kiev. But I will come to that shortly. I also have heard reports, I can't confirm these, that there is apparently the first moves towards some kind of Ukrainian withdrawal from the city of Kharkov. Now, this isn't something I can confirm at all, and it does seem the reports I'm hearing are extremely tentative and have been disputed. But there's reports that a Ukrainian politician called Arsen Avakov, who was for many years Ukraine's interior minister, and who is somebody who is trusted and whose leadership is to a great extent accepted by some of the far-right battalions that make up the Ukrainian military, including in Kharkiv, that he has been to Kharkiv, and that his purpose in going there was to arrange for the withdrawal of some of these troops from Kharkiv. And the intention apparently is to withdraw them to Kiev and to make Kiev, in effect, the last line of defense. So, again, I want to stress these are tentative reports. I'm not obviously on the scene of the battle. I'm not able to verify or corroborate anything. But there are some of these reports coming out of Kharkiv that those sort of moves are indeed being made there. Now, obviously, there is the counter-narrative, which is that the Ukrainians are holding firm in Kharkiv and that they're holding firm in Kiev. But I would say that the people who promote this counter-narrative have extraordinarily little to say about the true center of gravity of the actual battle, which is in eastern Ukraine. And of course, that is where the major battle is taking place. In military terms, Kharkiv, the fight in Kharkiv is something of a sideshow, or so it seems to me, whilst in Kiev itself, there has been no fighting to speak of at all. Now, I say that because I'm now going to come to the issue of Kiev. And here I'm going to offer certain comparisons between what's happening in Kiev and what has happened in Syria after the Russians intervened, because I think this illustrates fairly well the Russian approach to these sort of crises. Now, in my previous program, I said that the Russians do not make these rigid distinctions between diplomacy and war fighting that we do in the West. So it's entirely typical of the Russians to continue to discuss and negotiate with the other side even as battle is underway. It's a little bit like the United States in 2003, even as its army advanced on Baghdad, continuing to hold negotiations with Saddam Hussein's government in some third city, the capital of some third city, say Amman in Jordan. It's not something in the West that we fully understand or ever do, but it is very typical of how the Russians work. And coming back to many of the discussions and speculations about why there hasn't been a Russian assault on Kiev, despite the fact that very substantial units of the Russian army are now based there. It is nothing to do, in my opinion, with any intense resistance by the Ukrainian military, and it is nothing to do either with the logistical problems that some people in the media are now talking about. It is precisely because the Russians, for the moment, do not want to storm Kiev. They want to negotiate some kind of a settlement, though they're making it very clear that it must be a settlement on their terms. Now, let's wind back and look at a situation very similar to this one, or at least similar in some ways to this one, which was the so-called siege of Aleppo that took place in Syria in 2016. In 2016, an area of Aleppo, around half the city in territorial terms, was controlled up to 2016 by fighters seeking the overthrow of President Assad's government. And what happened is that with Russian aerial support, the Syrian military was able gradually to encircle this area of Aleppo and place it under essential siege. But note that no attempt was actually made to storm this part of the city. Instead, supplies were gradually cut off and negotiations for the withdrawal of those fighters in Aleppo took place. And there were multiple ceasefires over the course of these negotiations as the negotiations were underway. And in addition, and very importantly, the Russians also repeatedly agreed to what were called humanitarian corridors. Now, these humanitarian corridors, which were very much a feature of the Battle of Aleppo, but which were also set up by the Russians in other cities and towns in Syria, which were under the control of the fighters who were fighting President Assad, they were first and foremost intended to allow civilians to leave these urban areas, isolating the fighters there. And of course, and importantly, they were also specifically set up to allow an opportunity for those fighters to negotiate an exit, a retreat from those cities. And of course, the condition always was that they leave most of their weapons behind, except sometimes light weapons, but that they actually vacate these cities. So once the fighters left the cities, then the Syrian military, backed by the Russians, was able to move into these cities, into these settlements, and take them over, well, essentially intact. And it seems to me that this is essentially what is happening in Ukraine today. We're seeing that the Russians position their forces around cities, Kharkiv, Kiev, those sort of places, where there are large numbers of Ukrainian troops, and then they negotiate. And the purpose of their negotiation, firstly, has been to set up humanitarian corridors. This is exactly the same pattern as that was followed in Syria. And the purpose of those humanitarian corridors, obviously, is to let the civilians leave, but also, if need be, and after they hand over their heavy weapons, to allow the Ukrainian troops encircled in these cities to leave as well. And in Syria, a sanctuary area was created to which these fighters were allowed to withdraw, which is Idlib in northwest Syria, an area, by the way, parts of which are still outside the Syrian government's control. And I suspect that if something similar is worked out in Ukraine, we will see many of these fighters, many of these Ukrainian troops, those who are not willing to surrender or to melt away back into civilian life, I expect that the place where they will be allowed to retreat to will be Western Ukraine, the former Habsburg province of Galicia, the area of which Lviv is now the capital. So that, I suspect, is the scenario we're looking at. Now, in relation to the events in Syria, most of the substantive negotiations took place between the Russians and the people who, the government, which they saw as the ultimate sponsor of these fighters that were in Aleppo and other places, which was the Turkish government. There is no analogous third-party government that the Russians can work with in order to facilitate these retreats in Ukraine, except, of course, the Ukrainian government itself. And that is one reason why these negotiations are taking place in Belarus between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And the setting up of the humanitarian corridors is the first step in this Russian approach, this Russian policy. Now, both in respect of the situation in Syria and in respect of the situation in Ukraine, there is also undoubtedly a political dimension to the negotiations. Both in Syria and Ukraine, the Russians have come up with various proposals for a political settlement of the conflict in those two countries. I would say that I have always been deeply cynical of the proposals that the Russians made to settle the conflict in Syria, and I'm equally cynical about the proposals that the Russians are making to settle the conflict in Ukraine. By which I mean that I don't think that these proposals that have been made to the fighters in Syria, to the Turkish government, in relation to the conflict in Syria, or to the Ukrainian government, are intended exactly insincerely, in the sense that if, say, the Ukrainian government were to sign up to all the things that the Russians are demanding, neutrality, demilitarization, the cleansing from Ukraine of the far right, those sort of things, I think that the Russians would accept that. They would not go back on the demands that they are making. But I think that the Russians know perfectly well that the government in Kiev is unable to meet these demands. So I think that the purpose is gradually to isolate the government in Kiev, very much as the fighters in Syria were isolated, and perhaps in furtherance of an ultimate settlement, to split the government in Kiev, or various politicians in Kiev who make up that government, conceivably also Zelensky himself, from the radicals, the far-right battalions, from people like perhaps Arsen Avakov, who would be more willing to fight to the end. So I think that this is partly what this negotiation is all about. Firstly, it's draining the Ukrainian military out of the cities. Their position is steadily made untenable. They're offered the option to leave. They eventually leave. The civilians are able to leave also. So I think that's partly the purpose. The other purpose, as has also happened in Syria, is to start to play the various factions that make up the military on the other side, the political forces on the other side, off against each other, in order to identify ultimately those people the Russians believe they can work with. Now, they've done that very successfully in Syria. They've also done that very successfully in Chechnya during the long war that was fought there in the 2000s. And that, by the way, has ensured that Chechnya now is fully under the control of political forces that are not just loyal to them, but are fully embedded within the Russian power structure. And I get the sense that the Russians are looking to do the same in Ukraine. They're looking to isolate Ukrainian politicians who they believe they can work with from those who are irreconcilable in order to set up political structures in Ukraine that can assist the Russians to achieve those political objectives in Ukraine that they have set themselves. Now, here I must say one important thing. When I speak of Ukraine, I think from the Russian point of view, that means eastern and central Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine, the Russian-speaking areas, and central Ukraine, the capital Kiev, and the Ukrainian-speaking but Orthodox areas around it, all of which previously, before the Second World War, formed part of first the Soviet Union and then of the Tsarist Empire. I think that the Russians have no interest in bringing Western Ukraine, the former Habsburg province of Galicia, into this system. I think that they have long since worked out that it is irreconcilable and it is simply not important enough to their purposes to be brought under control. In fact, as I said, it is more likely to serve the function of a sanctuary area for all of these fighters than anything else. Now, this is a radically different way of conducting war than that which we are accustomed to in the West. And I think that one of the major problems is that Westerners don't understand this, so that we see all kinds of Western commentaries which try to apply Western approaches to the very different Russian approach and are somewhat bewildered and are unable to understand why the Russians don't do the things that the Westerners would have done in the same kind of situation. So when the Russians build up a large force near Kiev, they expect it to be used immediately to storm Kiev. The fact that it is there primarily in order to to exert pressure on the Ukrainian government in Kiev and gradually to encircle Kiev and to isolate it from the rest of the country, that isn't something I think that Westerners really understand. So they try to explain this by things like the resistance of the Ukrainians, of which of course there has been some, but little evidence of very much. To give one example, there's been much talk about supposedly successful attempts by the Ukrainian military to recapture Gostomel airport, which the Russians captured on the very first day of the war. And there have been numerous reports by the Ukrainians that they have in fact recovered Gostomel airport. Well, a Russian television team was there and it has confirmed that the airport is in fact fully under Russian control. So there is this narrative of Ukrainian resistance, which I think is frankly very overstated. In fact, I don't get the sense that there's been much fighting in and around Kiev at all. And then there's the second narrative, which is that the Russians are suffering logistic problems, which I think again misunderstands the fact that this force that's been deployed close to Kiev at the moment has no orders to advance straight into the city. It's there more than anything else in order to exert pressure on the Ukrainian government and to keep the Ukrainian forces concentrated so that the other parts of the Russian military can gradually complete the encirclement of Kiev itself. But note again that when it comes to Kiev and Kharkiv and all of these other places, the Russians have again been negotiating the setting up of humanitarian corridors. So I think this is the way the Russians are running things. It's, as I said, I've said many times, I'm not a military person, But it does seem to me that the best way to make sense of what's happening, based on the factual reports we're getting from the ground, is to look at what the Russians have done in other places. It's what they did in Syria. It's what they also did, by the way, during that long war in Chechnya, and they're applying the same methods to Ukraine. And of course, here we come to the important difference, because the American way of war is extremely successful on its own terms. I mean, it did result in 2003 in the overthrow of Saddam Hussein's government and in the fall of Baghdad. But of course, achieving that left a vacuum in the country. There was no political structures set up to take its place. The US had little idea of whom to work with in the country, and very quickly Iraq spiraled into chaos, and the US has never found it possible at any point thereafter to gain complete control. Whereas the Russian way of war, operating in an extremely different fashion, aims, on the contrary, to create political structures which are much more responsive to Russian wishes, and to avoid that kind of vacuum being created at almost any cost. And you can see that also in Russian behavior in some of the cities that they have captured. And this has been true in places like Kherson, it's been true in Melitopol. Whenever they've moved in, whenever the Russians have moved into one of these cities, which have fallen under their military control, they have not removed the civilian administration. They've left the mayors and the bureaucracy intact. They've allowed the bureaucrats, the civilian officials, to continue to fly the Ukrainian flag. They've allowed normal processes of civilian administration to continue, because of course ultimately and eventually they want to assimilate them into whatever political structure they are intending eventually to create in Ukraine. And the result is, or so the hope is, that a vacuum in Ukraine is avoided. Now, I'm going to finish by making two quick observations. Explaining things doesn't mean any kind of moral or ethical endorsement. As I made very clear in the very first program that I did after the war began, I have a deep and profound horror of war. I am absolutely willing to condemn it. I'm not, however, I don't see that doing so in these sort of programs really helps understand very much what is going on. And I see my purpose in making these programs to explain my analysis and understanding of the situation, which may of course be wrong. It may be that I'm seeing things that aren't there, or I'm misjudging what's actually happening, though I'm fairly confident that in this analysis I'm correct. But anyway, I think that is ultimately a more useful thing to do than simply coming up with words of condemnation, of which there have been plenty, and of which my adding my own, to the extent that I haven't already, isn't going to achieve anything. And the second point I want to make is that though this may be the Russian plan in Ukraine, it may be what they're trying to do, it doesn't mean that it's going to succeed. You can have the best of plans, or you can have the most carefully thought out plan, but as I think it was Clausewitz once said, no plan, no battle plan ever survives the first encounter with the enemy. So it doesn't mean that the Russian plan is going to work. I'm just explaining what I think the Russian plan is. I will say this, though I can't predict and won't predict the outcome. I think that this approach, certainly in a place like Ukraine, is much more likely to be successful than any other. It's certainly more likely to be successful than American-style shock and awe. All that does, as I said, is that it creates a vacuum at the center of power. It causes the state and its institutions to collapse, and then the occupying force, the United States in Iraq, the Russians in Ukraine, would be left with a state of chaos which is extremely difficult to control. So working in this way, which preserves the civilian administration, keeps the relevant officials in place, works with the government, the actual government in being, negotiating with it over ceasefires, local ceasefires, humanitarian corridors, that sort of thing, even as negotiations continue towards an overarching political settlement, which may never be agreed with that particular government, by the way, but which does provide a kind of ordered framework for the negotiations. All that, it seems to me, is far more likely to be successful and effective in the end than American-style shock and awe. That, at least, is my own perspective of this conflict and of the approach the Russians are taking. And I would say again that I think Westerners don't always fully understand it. They didn't fully understand it when it was applied in Syria, and they're completely unable to understand it when it is applied to Ukraine. I would say, just as a sequel, that the Russians did much the same when they occupied Czechoslovakia in 1968, another military act by the Russians which the world condemned. But note again that the Russians were careful to keep the Czech government in existence and to actually negotiate with it so as to achieve a settlement of the situation in what was then Czechoslovakia, which was ultimately in the interests of themselves. So I think this is very much the way Russians approach these matters. Well, we will see how this situation works out. I would urge people again to avoid some of the overblown and rather vivid accounts in the Western media. It's quite obvious to me that many of the people who write there, their passionate feelings are engaged, their emotions are engaged. They look at things very much in terms of the outcome that they desire, rather than the outcome that the events themselves point to. So I hope that you've learnt something from this program. I hope I've given you, if you don't agree with this, at least some food for thought. I look forward to you joining me again. I would remind you that you can find us on Rumble and Locals and in other platforms as well. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also go to our shop and find the various things that we sell there. And of course, if you want to support us further, well, you can tick the like button to this video if you've liked this video, and check your subscription to this channel. That is enough from me today. I look forward to you joining me again.